The late 19th century was given the name the Gilded Age by Mark Twain. During this time period, industrialization would introduce streetcars, trolleys, and other means of transportation which would lead to rich citizens moving from the city to more rural areas. While the rich moved away, the poor moved into their abandoned spaces. This was mainly because most were immigrant and lower class citizens. But while the rent was cheap, the spaces were often low maintenance and often kept in poor conditions. In 1889, Jacob Riis published his book, How the Other Half Lives, which showcased the poor living conditions of the citizens in the cities. In most of the tenements, there was hardly enough space for tenants to move around, poor sewage systems, and barely any clean water, which would lead to the spread of disease. A similar situation was taking place in the meatpacking factories. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, which he wrote after he posed as a worker in a meatpacking factory, to expose the poor sanitation and harsh working conditions. The Jungle was read by President Theodore Roosevelt himself, and he was appalled by what he read. This led to the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906, the Food and Drug Act, and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. The type of journalism done by Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair was known as muckraking. Also during this time period, many of the lower class and immigrants would have a hard time finding jobs, so they would turn to political machines for aid. One of the more popular machines would be known as Tammany Hall, led by William Meager Tweed, also known as Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was a famous politician in New York who was known for his corruption and bribery in politics. His most famous scandal was the Tweed Courthouse in 1861, where the construction costed more than the state of Alaska. Tweed was arrested in 1871 and charged with corruption, and later died in prison of heart failure in 1878. The Panic of 1893 would last from May 1893 to November 1893 due to a run in currency. Banks and businesses were closed because they could not pay the employee. It led to a stock market crash and over 300 banks and trust banks being closed due to the failure of several railroads. The resulting depression would eventually lead to national strikes, such as the Pullman strike. During the Pullman strike, the movement of any Pullman car would be refused except for cars that transported mail, due to mail being considered government property. Entertainment that would take place during this period was mainly vaudeville. Vaudeville acts included dance, circus acts, singing, and humor. Most humor would be based on ethnic identities. For example, blackface would characterize African Americans, and dialect acts would characterize Irish, Italians, Germans, and Jews. Circuses were also included and included trained animals, acrobats, and magicians. These people traveled around the country to perform and were mainly immigrants from the working class.